Just imagine, it's midnight in Boston, 1750. You hear breaking glass down the street. A merchant's shop is being robbed. You rush outside, but there's no 911 to call. No police cruisers will arrive with sirens blazing. No uniformed officers will take your statement. Because in colonial America, police as we know them simply didn't exist. So what did you do when criminals struck? When smugglers flooded your ports with illegal goods? When counterfeiters passed fake money that could destroy your town's economy? When organized criminal networks operated with seeming impunity? The answer might surprise you. Early Americans created a patchwork system of law enforcement that was simultaneously chaotic and ingenious, brutal and democratic, deeply flawed yet surprisingly effective. Tonight, we're diving into the untold story of how a nation without police confronted organized crime, and how their desperate solutions shaped the justice system we have today. To understand crime enforcement in early America, we must first grasp a fundamental truth. For over 150 years, from the first permanent English settlements in 1607 until well into the 1800s, America had no professional police force. Zero. What they had instead was a fragmented system imported from medieval England, adapted haphazardly to the challenges of the New World. Colonial law enforcement rested on four primary pillars: constables, watches, sheriffs, and the community itself. Constables were the first appointed law enforcement officers in colonial America. Typically unpaid or poorly compensated, these positions were often filled reluctantly by ordinary citizens who saw it as a civic duty rather than a career. The constable's job was enormous: serving warrants, collecting taxes, overseeing elections, and maintaining order. In many colonies, being a constable was mandatory. If selected, you served or paid a fine. The night watch system, established in Boston as early as 1631, became the backbone of urban crime prevention. Volunteers and later paid watchmen patrolled streets from sunset to sunrise, calling out the hours, watching for fires, and confronting criminals and disorderly persons. These weren't trained law enforcement professionals. They were shopkeepers, laborers, and tradesmen taking turns walking the dark streets with lanterns and wooden rattles to sound alarms. In Philadelphia, the night watch was formalized in 1700, with watchmen carrying bells to alert constables about criminal activity. Sheriffs, often appointed by colonial governors, held more authority than constables. They enforced court orders, collected taxes, supervised jails, and had the power to raise a posse comitatus, a group of able-bodied citizens temporarily deputized to pursue criminals. This ancient English practice meant that any citizen could be called upon to join a manhunt, and refusing carried penalties. Beyond these official positions existed the community enforcement mechanisms, the hue and cry and collective responsibility. When a crime occurred, any witness was legally required to raise a hue and cry, literally shouting and making noise to alert neighbors. Under English common law adopted by the colonies, anyone who heard the alarm was obligated to pursue the criminal or face punishment themselves. This created a system where crime prevention was everyone's responsibility. But here's the critical weakness. This system worked reasonably well for common street crimes: theft, assault, public drunkenness. It failed spectacularly against organized crime. Organized criminal activities in colonial America came in three primary forms: smuggling, counterfeiting, and illegal trading networks. These weren't crimes of passion or desperation. They were calculated enterprises requiring planning, resources, and coordination. Smuggling rings moved illegal goods worth hundreds of thousands of pounds annually. Counterfeiting operations produced fake currency so sophisticated that ordinary merchants couldn't detect it. These criminal networks crossed colonial boundaries, operated internationally, and required specialized knowledge and equipment. The British government estimated that over 700,000 pounds worth of goods were smuggled into American colonies illegally each year by the mid-1700s. That's equivalent to hundreds of millions in today's currency. Counterfeiters became so prolific that historian David R. Johnson notes, in the early 18th century, counterfeiting in America entered a kind of golden age that would last for roughly 150 years. By the Civil War era, perhaps half of all paper currency in circulation was counterfeit. Against these sophisticated criminal enterprises, the constable watch sheriff system was hopelessly inadequate. A night watchman making his rounds couldn't stop ships unloading smuggled Madeira wine in hidden coves. A constable serving warrants couldn't dismantle counterfeiting rings operating across colonial borders. Sheriffs lacked jurisdiction beyond their counties, and most colonies had no authority to enforce laws in other colonies. This created a perfect storm, rapidly growing criminal enterprises facing a primitive, fragmented, and under-resourced enforcement system. The result was improvisation, innovation, and sometimes chaos. Early Americans would need to develop new approaches to combat organized crime, approaches that often operated in legal gray areas and sometimes became indistinguishable from the criminality they sought to stop. Owen Sullivan, also known as the 40,000-pound moneymaker, represents perhaps the most successful organized criminal in colonial American history. His story reveals both the sophistication of colonial organized crime and the desperate measures authorities took to combat it. Sullivan was an Irish runaway who arrived in America with skills as an armorer and engraver, precisely the expertise needed for counterfeiting. In the mid-1700s, he established a counterfeiting operation that spanned multiple colonies. His fake currency was remarkably sophisticated. He used actual printing presses, created custom typefaces, and studied authentic bills to reproduce them with stunning accuracy. Sullivan boasted he could forge any colonial currency in circulation. What made Sullivan's operation truly organized crime was its network structure. He didn't work alone. He recruited engravers, printers, and distributors. He established safe houses where printing occurred. Most importantly, he created distribution networks that passed his counterfeit bills throughout the colonies, making it nearly impossible to trace back to the source. Colonial authorities struggled to stop him. Sullivan operated across colonial boundaries, and there was no coordination between jurisdictions. When Pennsylvania authorities got close, he'd move to New Jersey. When New Jersey heated up, he'd relocate to New York. The lack of intercolonial law enforcement cooperation was his greatest asset, but Sullivan made a critical mistake. He got greedy. He began counterfeiting currency from multiple colonies simultaneously, flooding markets with fake bills. This drew unprecedented attention. In 1756, New York authorities finally captured him after a coordinated effort, one of the first examples of multi-jurisdictional cooperation against organized crime in America. Sullivan's trial and punishment reveal the brutal realities of colonial justice. Because formal police investigations didn't exist, authorities relied on informants. Often fellow criminals offered leniency in exchange for testimony. Sullivan was convicted not through detective work, but through testimony from his own gang members who turned on him. His execution in New York on May 10, 1756, was postponed twice because authorities wanted maximum public impact. When finally hanged, Sullivan claimed to have forged more than 40,000 pounds worth of colonial currency, an astronomical sum. But the execution didn't end counterfeiting. It barely made a dent. The New York Times reported in 2011 that Sullivan's execution capitalized on a vulnerability of the colony's paper money. It was exceedingly easy to copy. If you want to understand how organized crime and law enforcement collided in colonial America, look no further than the burning of HMS Gaspee in Rhode Island's Narragansett Bay on June 10, 1772. Smuggling was colonial America's most prevalent organized crime. The British Navigation Acts required all colonial goods to pass through British ports and be taxed, but colonists viewed these laws as oppressive and routinely violated them. Smuggling wasn't just common, it was essential to colonial commerce. Ships laden with contraband rum, molasses, tea, wine, and manufactured goods moved regularly through American ports. Rhode Island was smuggling central. Its merchants had perfected the art of evading British customs officials. When legitimate enforcement proved ineffective, the British government tried a new approach. They sent armed naval vessels to aggressively enforce trade laws. Enter Lieutenant William Duddingston and HMS Gaspee, a British customs schooner that arrived in Rhode Island waters in early 1772. Duddingston was zealous, stopping colonial vessels, confiscating cargoes, making arrests. He was doing exactly what he was supposed to do, enforcing British law against organized smuggling operations. But from the colonists' perspective, Duddingston wasn't law enforcement, he was a pirate. The aggressive tactics infuriated Rhode Islanders. On June 9, 1772, while chasing a suspected smuggling vessel called the Hannah, Duddingston ran the Gaspee aground on a sandbar near Warwick. Word spread quickly through Providence. That night, a group of prominent Rhode Islanders, including wealthy merchants and community leaders, organized a raid. Led by merchant John Brown, approximately 60 men in 8 longboats rowed out to the stranded Gaspee under cover of darkness. They boarded the vessel, wounded Lieutenant Duddingston, and set the ship ablaze. The Gaspee burned to the waterline and sank. This wasn't mob violence. It was organized resistance to law enforcement. The raiders included some of Rhode Island's most prominent citizens. They planned the attack, coordinated timing, and ensured Duddingston's crew wasn't killed. This was organized crime against what they viewed as tyrannical enforcement. The British response revealed the impossibility of investigating crimes without proper law enforcement infrastructure. The Crown established a special commission to investigate and promised substantial rewards for information. But despite knowing many raiders' identities, authorities couldn't secure convictions. Why? Because local communities protected the perpetrators. Grand juries refused to indict. Witnesses refused to testify. The community-based justice system that was supposed to enforce law instead protected lawbreakers when they viewed the law as unjust. No one was ever prosecuted for burning the Gaspee. The affair demonstrated that without professional, neutral law enforcement, crime and justice became matters of community consensus rather than legal standards. John Hancock, yes, the founding father with the famous signature, ran one of colonial Boston's largest smuggling operations. His case illustrates how organized crime prosecution worked in the vice-admiralty court system. In May 1768, Hancock's sloop Liberty arrived in Boston Harbor carrying 25 pipes, large barrels, of Madeira wine. Hancock declared the cargo and paid duties on 25 pipes, but customs officials suspected smuggling. 2 tidesmen, customs inspectors, who boarded the ship reported being locked in the cabin below deck, while the crew unloaded approximately 100 additional pipes of wine under cover of darkness, wine on which no duties were paid. On June 10, 1768, British customs officials seized the Liberty, accusing Hancock of smuggling. The ship was confiscated and towed to a British naval vessel for protection. This sparked riots in Boston, with crowds attacking customs officials and forcing them to flee to Castle William for safety. Hancock was charged in the vice-admiralty court, special courts established to handle maritime crimes, including smuggling. These courts operated without juries, with judges appointed by the Crown. Colonists hated them, viewing them as instruments of oppression that denied the right to trial by jury. John Adams, the future president, defended Hancock. The case dragged on for months, becoming a legal and political sensation. Adams's defense strategy exposed the weaknesses in the enforcement system. He challenged the credibility of the tidesmen witnesses, questioned the legality of the search, and argued that the seizure violated Hancock's rights. Here's what makes this case remarkable. Despite clear evidence of smuggling, the prosecution eventually dropped charges. Why? The enforcement system lacked investigative capabilities. Everything depended on witness testimony, in this case, two tidesmen whose story had inconsistencies. Without forensic evidence, paper trails, or professional investigation, prosecutors couldn't build an airtight case against a wealthy, politically connected defendant with the best legal representation. The Liberty case revealed a dark truth. In colonial America's law enforcement system, justice often depended on wealth, connections, and community standing rather than guilt or innocence. Wealthy merchants like Hancock could hire skilled lawyers and weather lengthy proceedings. Poor smugglers faced swift, harsh justice. Without professional police, colonial authorities relied heavily on bounty hunters and reward systems to combat organized crime. This created a mercenary approach to law enforcement with perverse incentives. Colonial governments and private businesses offered substantial rewards for capturing counterfeiters, smugglers, and other organized criminals. Rewards of £50 to £100, equivalent to several years' wages for ordinary workers, attracted professional bounty hunters and amateur opportunists alike. Benjamin Franklin's Pennsylvania Gazette regularly published notices offering rewards for criminal apprehension. A typical notice from 1750 offered £20 reward for apprehending the body of criminal name, guilty of counterfeiting Pennsylvania bills of credit. The bounty system had serious problems. First, it encouraged vigilantism and violence. Bounty hunters operated with minimal oversight. They could cross colonial boundaries pursuing suspects. Some bounty hunters were barely distinguishable from criminals themselves, rough men using rough methods. Second, the system incentivized false accusations. If you could convince authorities someone was a counterfeiter and collect the reward, you might be tempted to target personal enemies or vulnerable individuals who couldn't defend themselves. Third, it created conflicts of interest. Citizens who captured criminals and received rewards were then expected to testify at trials. This gave them financial incentives to ensure convictions regardless of actual guilt. Despite these flaws, bounty hunting was one of the few effective tools against organized crime. When Owen Sullivan was finally captured, informants motivated by reward money provided crucial intelligence. When counterfeiting rings were broken up, it was often because gang members betrayed each other for reward money. The system worked not because it was just, but because it was brutal and economically motivated. It turned citizens into mercenary law enforcement, creating a violent, chaotic approach to fighting organized crime. The absence of professional law enforcement in colonial America created profound social consequences that rippled through communities and shaped American attitudes toward justice, government authority, and individual rights for generations. The most immediate impact was erosion of social trust. When justice depended on community enforcement, neighbors watching neighbors, citizens pursuing citizens, it transformed social relationships into potential enforcement relationships. The hue and cry system legally obligated you to pursue criminals, but who decided who was criminal? When enforcement became everyone's responsibility, paranoia became rational. Consider the counterfeiting crisis. By the mid-1700s, merchants couldn't trust currency. Kenneth Scott's research shows that some counterfeit colonial bills had obvious errors. Justice spelled as instis, missing letters, upside-down type. Yet these crude fakes still circulated because rural colonists lacked familiarity with authentic money. The result was economic anxiety. Every transaction carried risk. Trust, the foundation of commerce, eroded. Without neutral, professional law enforcement, justice often became mob justice. The Gaspee affair exemplified this. When a community decided that official law enforcement was unjust, they took matters into their own hands. This wasn't protest, it was organized violence against government authorities. The problem with vigilante justice is that it answers to no standard except community sentiment. Today's hero could be tomorrow's criminal, depending on which faction held power. Historian Johnson notes that this pattern continued long after the colonial period. Vigilantism found fertile ground in the United States, beginning in colonial times and extending into the early federal period. Organized crime, particularly counterfeiting and smuggling, had devastating economic impacts. When George Washington wrote that a wagon load of money will scarcely purchase a wagon load of provisions, he was describing the inflation caused by counterfeit currency flooding the economy. This undermined confidence in paper money for generations. Many Americans distrusted paper currency well into the 19th century, insisting on hard currency, gold and silver, because they'd been burned by counterfeits. Smuggling had different effects. While British authorities viewed it as theft of tax revenue, many colonists saw smuggling as necessary economic survival. The British Navigation Acts restricted trade in ways that made legal commerce nearly impossible. Smuggling wasn't crime, it was market correction. This created moral ambiguity where criminals were often community heroes, and law enforcement was viewed as oppression. Ironically, the brutal, chaotic nature of colonial law enforcement planted seeds for modern constitutional protections. The vice-admiralty court's denial of jury trials outraged colonists and directly influenced the Sixth Amendment's guarantee of trial by jury. The broad search powers claimed by customs officials, writs of assistance allowing searches without specific warrants, sparked fury that led to the Fourth Amendment's protections against unreasonable searches. The bounty hunter system's abuses and the ease with which false accusations could ruin lives contributed to developing stronger due process protections. When John Adams defended John Hancock, he was arguing for principles that would later become constitutional bedrock: the presumption of innocence, the right to confront witnesses, the requirement for proof beyond reasonable doubt. Perhaps most troubling was how the colonial enforcement system reinforced social inequalities. Wealthy individuals like Hancock could hire lawyers, delay proceedings, and often escape consequences. Poor criminals faced swift, brutal punishment: whipping, branding, pillory, stocks, and execution. Justice wasn't blind, it was acutely aware of social class. This pattern of unequal justice based on wealth and connections has never fully disappeared from American society. The colonial struggle with organized crime without professional police resonates powerfully with contemporary debates about law enforcement, community policing, and criminal justice reform. The parallels are striking and instructive. Today's community policing movement advocates for law enforcement deeply embedded in neighborhoods, with officers who know residents personally and work collaboratively with communities to prevent crime. This echoes the colonial constable watch system, where enforcement was inherently local and community-based. But colonial experience teaches us the limitations. Community-based enforcement works well when communities are cohesive and share values. It fails when communities fracture, when different groups disagree about what constitutes crime, or when enforcement becomes partisan. The Gaspee affair demonstrated that community-based systems can become vigilantism when communities reject the legitimacy of laws they enforce. Modern community policing must balance local accountability with professional standards and neutral enforcement, exactly what colonial America lacked. The bounty hunter system's legacy survives today. Bail bondsmen employ bounty hunters, now called fugitive recovery agents, to apprehend suspects who skip bail. Private security firms protect property and people. Some jurisdictions outsource certain law enforcement functions to private companies. This raises the same concerns colonial Americans faced. Can justice be left to profit-motivated actors? Bounty hunting created perverse incentives in colonial America, encouraging violence, false accusations, and due process violations. Modern private law enforcement faces similar criticisms, particularly regarding immigration enforcement and prison operations. Counterfeiters plagued colonial America because technology, printing presses, made crime easier than enforcement could adapt. Today's parallel is cybercrime. Digital counterfeiting, fraud, Identity theft and ransomware present the same challenge. Criminals using technology faster than enforcement can respond. Just as colonial counterfeiters operated across colonial boundaries, where jurisdictions couldn't coordinate, modern cybercriminals operate across national borders where enforcement jurisdiction ends. The internet is our porous colonial frontier where organized crime flourishes because enforcement hasn't adapted. The colonial response, improvisation, bounties, harsh punishments, mirrors some modern responses. Private cybersecurity firms, bounty hunters, international law enforcement cooperation efforts, the coordination that finally caught Owen Sullivan, and severe criminal penalties attempting to deter through fear. Perhaps most importantly, colonial experience forces us to confront a fundamental question. When does law enforcement lose legitimacy? Colonists viewed British customs enforcement as oppressive, so they resisted violently. They didn't see themselves as criminals. They saw themselves as freedom fighters against unjust laws. This raises uncomfortable questions for modern America. When communities view law enforcement as illegitimate, as occupying forces rather than protectors, what happens? The answer is resistance, non-cooperation, and sometimes violence. Recent movements questioning police legitimacy, calling for defunding or abolishing police, and advocating for community-based alternatives echo colonial debates. How much enforcement power should government have? Should communities control their own justice? Can enforcement be separated from oppression? Colonial America tried community-controlled, minimal government law enforcement. It produced chaos, vigilantism, and justice that varied wildly by location and community sentiment. But it also produced resistance to tyranny and principles of individual rights that became constitutional foundations. The Treasury Department redesigns currency every 7 to 10 years because counterfeiters adapt. This arms race began in colonial America when Benjamin Franklin used nature-printed leaves to thwart counterfeiters. The lesson is clear. Enforcement must continuously adapt to criminal innovation. This requires investment, coordination, and specialized expertise, exactly what colonial America lacked, and precisely what modern law enforcement must maintain to address evolving organized crime threats. We began tonight in colonial Boston, imagining a world without police, without 911, without professional law enforcement infrastructure. We've journeyed through the chaotic, brutal, and improvised systems that early Americans created to combat sophisticated organized crime with primitive tools. The story we've uncovered is neither a tale of noble vigilantes protecting communities, nor a simple narrative of chaos and injustice. It's something more complex, a society struggling to balance order and liberty, justice and mercy, community control and centralized authority. Owen Sullivan's counterfeiting empire flourished because colonial law enforcement couldn't coordinate across boundaries. The HMS Gaspee burned because communities rejected enforcement they viewed as tyrannical. John Hancock escaped prosecution because wealth bought justice that poor smugglers could never access. Bounty hunters pursued criminals for profit, creating a mercenary approach to justice with all the moral hazards that entails. These weren't aberrations. They were features of a system designed around local control, minimal government, and community responsibility. That system had virtues. It was democratic, locally accountable, and resistant to centralized tyranny. But it also produced vigilantism, unequal justice, and an inability to combat sophisticated criminal enterprises. When we debate modern law enforcement, community policing, private security, criminal justice reform, we're revisiting debates colonial Americans faced. They tried minimal, community-based enforcement. They discovered its limitations through painful experience. Their failures and improvisations ultimately led to professional policing beginning in the mid-1800s. But professionalization brought new problems: distance from communities, lack of accountability, potential for systematic abuse. We've spent the past 150 years trying to balance professionalization with community connection, specialized capability with local accountability, effective enforcement with civil liberties protection. History teaches us there are no perfect solutions. Colonial America's approach failed against organized crime, but protected individual liberty and community autonomy. Modern professional policing can combat sophisticated crime, but risks alienation from communities and abuse of power. Perhaps the lesson is humility. We should neither romanticize colonial justice as simpler and purer, nor dismiss it as primitive chaos. We should recognize that every enforcement system involves trade-offs between competing values, order and liberty, efficiency and fairness, community control and professional capability. As you consider modern debates about law enforcement, remember Owen Sullivan counterfeiting across colonial boundaries, Rhode Islanders burning the Gaspee, John Hancock escaping prosecution, and bounty hunters pursuing profit. Remember that enforcement systems shape not just crime rates but social trust, economic stability, and the relationship between citizens and government. The question isn't whether colonial America's approach was better or worse than ours. The question is, what can we learn from their struggles to inform our choices today? Share your thoughts in the comments. Could any element of colonial law enforcement improve modern policing? What lessons should we draw from their experience? And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into America's hidden history, the stories that shape the nation we live in today.